working at a startup is like a giant hackathon. Like you're trying to prove something, but it's not always the technical feasibility. In fact, more often than not, I would say the biggest obstacle is not technical feasibility. Most startups fail, not because they couldn't like technically build the thing, but because nobody wanted it. It doesn't matter if you're using the latest technology, if you've got the best design, the flashiest visual design. At the end of the day, what really matters is what you're doing for the person on the other end. And so as soon as you could start kind of thinking through that lens, the better off you are.
Welcome back to the BeaverHacks Podcast. I'm your host, Havel Kanda, and today we have Chris Abad. He is a UX designer, formerly worked at Google and Dropbox, and we're going to get to know him a little bit and get into some very, very unique perspectives. And while this isn't our typical, CS programming, we're going to have a really cool discussion with him. Getting right into it, you have your own podcast, actually, Pixelated Path. I'm just curious to know what inspired you to start this podcast.
Beginning last year, I decided I wanted to create more content to share a bunch of the stuff that I've learned over the course of my career. And I really like video. So I decided I would do it on video. And I made a few other YouTube videos about different tips and things for UX designers. I decided to switch to podcasting for a couple reasons. One is just in the long run, like I feel like I can do a much better job just having like good, fun conversations with cool people. It's a little bit easier to do that consistently. And also a lot of the new grad designers that I would mentor, we would talk a lot about like how to interview, how to improve their portfolio, like a bunch of skill stuff. But every now and then folks would ask me like how I got to where I was and the path that I took. And I thought, I know a lot of other people who have been at this, about as long as I have, and everyone has really interesting stories. And wouldn't it be cool if I just went around and asked everyone that same question? And we, spent an hour or so talking about what their path was. And so far that's worked out really well. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I feel like for people in our fields specifically, podcasting isn't like a typical thing that people usually go towards. As a medium, it's definitely a different world entirely. What's that whole process been like, just being in this world?
A lot of learning. I probably spent more time than I should have before I published my first video anything, just learning about publishing video, writing scripts, editing video, like all the different skills that go with it. Because this was all stuff that I'd never done before. And so like I read a bunch of articles, I took classes online. A few of the ones that I really liked, I took Ali Abdal's part-time YouTube creator course. That was super fun. I'm trying to remember his name, but there's a really good course called Dream Studio. It's a cohort-based class, and he sort of walks you through how to like set up your own like YouTube studio, especially if you're doing it from home, with just whether it's like the lighting, the composition, the camera, like all the stuff. So I spent a lot of time tinkering, and then finally I just got up the nerve to record something and publish. By the time I switched from doing like 15-minute instructional videos to podcasting, I was a little bit more comfortable. But yeah, and there's a few folks out there that have been really inspiring to do this in our field. One of my favorite is Lenny's podcast. He has a really successful podcast for mostly product managers, but basically anyone who builds software. So designers, engineers. The Design Better podcast is a great one that's more focused on like not just UX design, but a lot of people in the creative field. So there's a few out there, certainly not as many as maybe in other fields. I think a lot of people aren't comfortable getting on video and seeing themselves and hearing themselves. And I think because I am, it gives me an advantage.
Do you feel like there's like one specific episode that was like your favorite out of all the ones you've done?
It's been really cool because you kind of never know what you're going to get. In a lot of these episodes, we just kind of we start with how people got interested in the field in the first place and kind of work through, especially early days in their career when there are a lot of like, that's kind of when you make probably your most mistakes and learnings and stuff like that. And so that's really interesting to talk about. But a few of the like interesting stories that stand out, I had one guest, Brill, and I've worked with her at both Salesforce and at Google, and now she's at HubSpot. But she's gone through a couple layoffs, and at least the first layoff was when she was on a work visa, and so it was like terrifying. And she had to like work through, what am I going to do next? I think that was a great story, especially for a lot of folks who are like going through things like layoffs right now. I think just hearing stories about how people kind of bounce back is really helpful. I had another guest, Colin, who I worked with him at Dropbox. He's now head of design at Grammarly. And his story about how he got his start and like cold calling at ad agencies and just being relentless as like a young teenager. I thought was so cool. Doesn't have a design background, but just sort of like got into it through instinct, natural talent, and grit. So stories like that I really appreciate, but I mean they come up so often. I don't know if I have a favorite yet.
I think on that note, you focus a lot on stories, and I know a huge part of like your podcast and what you teach is the storytelling part of design. Why do you think storytelling in design is such an important part of the UX process and the designing process?
So I think storytelling skills, like if you're good at storytelling, it helps you in a few different ways. And actually a lot of it is like outside of the design process itself. Some within the design process, but like let's say you're really great at design, you do good work, you've produced your experience, whatever that is. Like let's say it's in Figma, it's like this great design for this product. Being able to tell a story about that and who it benefits and why you did what you did is really, really important because for most people, even if you're an amazing designer, you have to be able to share that with other people around you because most people can't build software 100% on their own, especially at scale. And the bigger the company and the bigger the scale, the more people that you have to work with. So if you're a designer, you're also working with engineers, product managers, other executives, sales, marketing, all these folks. And you have to be able to help them understand the vision that you have and motivate them to get like behind you and participate. And so storytelling helps a lot with that. And I would say that skill applies to all the disciplines when it comes to building software because everyone comes up with ideas. Engineers come up with ideas, product managers come up with ideas. And it's the best idea is not always the one that wins, even though you'd like to think so. Like you have to be able to communicate that idea really well to the people around you. And the better that you can do that, the more impact you're able to have. It just sort of like it's like a multiplier of, you know, your effect. That's one of the main things that I talk a lot about and work on with my teams. I have an online course that I teach that's I talk a lot about design, but really like design, product, anyone who's in a position where they sort of need to share with the folks around them, with the team around them, what their vision is for a user experience or for a product and use storytelling to do that effectively. But also when it comes to design specifically and how you do design, there are aspects of storytelling that can be really helpful because and I think something that designers learn as they become more senior and more experienced is they learn to go beyond the tactics of like how do things work and what do I put where and how does it look? And you start thinking about what is this person actually going through? What do I want their experience to be? What problem am I solving for them? And what does that look like in their day-to-day life? And so you have to have almost like a story-based mental model of the thing you're creating and the person you're doing this for. And so there's a, just like in a story, there's a hero of that story. If you're designing software, that hero is the user. And you have to know what their backstory is. Like, why do they care about this? And what are they struggling with? And what is their day like? And then how am I going to change their day with this thing that I'm designing so that it's even better? So that mentality of like putting a person at the center and thinking about their day and their backstory and those skills are really helpful and help you do design better also.
Do you feel like that's something that's maybe overlooked? Because we get so focused on, I know at least from, computer science students and like software engineers, we get so focused on the technical aspect of it, where we get lost and then we don't really focus on the vision, the big picture.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's overlooked. I would say it comes with experience because you have to learn the craft, whatever your craft is. If you're an engineer, if you're a designer, you have to be really technically proficient. And that takes repetition, that takes learning, that takes practice. And so, I don't know, like let's say you're driving a car. If you've never driven a car before, you have to think a lot about gas, brake, turn signals, mirrors. Like you have to think about the specifics. But at some point you just get proficient, so you don't really have to think about it. And then you can think about like bigger picture, like where am I going and how do I enjoy this trip? And is there a more efficient way to get to where I'm going? But if you start there, it can get really overwhelming. So it kind of depends on where you are in your career. But I think at the beginning, you do have to sort of like focus on your craft and get really good at that before you can pick your head up and start putting the pieces together. But to the extent that you can, the faster that you can sort of, if you know that's the end goal, the faster that you can kind of push yourself there and the faster that you can ask around you how to like think that way and how to kind of get to that level, the better off you are, because that is absolutely where the best work happens. Like if you're always just focused on your lane and your piece and you're sort of cog in the machine, you plateau, like you stop growing. And so once you've learned the craft, once you've learned the skills, that's what you need to start doing is start thinking about like, now, how does this all fit together? Who's the person on the other end that I'm actually affecting? Because that's really what matters. It doesn't matter if you're using the latest technology, if you've got the best design, the flashiest visual design. At the end of the day, what really matters is what you're doing for the person on the other end. And so as soon as you could start kind of thinking through that lens, the better off you are.
You mentioned like being a cog in a machine and kind of focusing on that. And you previously worked at Google and Dropbox. Would you like to share a little bit about what those experiences were like working at those huge, like big tech companies?
Before Dropbox, I spent a lot of time at startups. I started my career with, I founded a couple of my own startups, and then I spent more than 10 years working at other people's startups. And so these are companies that are, 100 people to a few hundred people. And then I end up at Dropbox, which is like thousands. And then you go to Google, which is like tens of thousands. The core of the work doesn't change a lot. Like the craft skills that you need stay the same. But the other skills that you need on top of that to be effective, those change quite a bit. At least for me, this is how it was in my role. I was also a manager. And so a big part of my role ends up being like communication and sort of keeping everyone on the same page and everyone kind of moving in the same direction. And the bigger a company is, that gets so much more complicated really, really fast. When I was at Google, our team worked with many, many other teams across Google. We supported every product at Google, and Google's got more than 200 consumer products. They've got the big ones, and then they have this long tail of just like a bunch of other products. And so we had a lot of people that we had to work with. And so a lot of the job is just like trying to keep in sync and staying aligned and having the same goals and making sure that, we're all clear with each other. And that just doesn't take nearly as much work when the company's only 100 people. That's a big difference. If you're more in an individual contributor role, then one of the big differences, and maybe this is what you were talking about before, is you tend to have a lot more like agency in a smaller company, and you tend to own more surface area. And so, especially for someone who's early in their career, it is much easier to have the opportunity to think about the bigger picture because the things that you're working on look more like the big picture. If you're early in your career and you're at a really big company, the thing you're working on is maybe a little piece of the bigger picture. And so it's a lot harder to try to understand how that ladders up to like the whole thing. That's a pretty big difference.
Do you feel like, I guess, comparing those two experiences and working at different scales of companies, is there one that you prefer? Like, would you prefer being kind of at a startup and having more involvement in it, or kind of being a smaller piece of a bigger picture? Or do you see both as maybe the same and you kind of just know your place in each one?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say they're the same, but I don't know if I favor one more than the other. They both kind of have their pros and cons. And so I like the variety. And I think it's great experience for someone to kind of like have at least a few years of each type under their belt if they can, to kind of know what you like and where you do your best work. But they have their pros and cons. Like in a smaller company, things move faster. You tend to get to own more scope, but it's a little bit chaotic. You tend to always feel very like under resourced, and so it's very scrappy. You're always trying to like make do with just a little bit less than what you actually need. In a larger company, there's a lot more structure. It's a little bit more directed. And so like if you don't like the ambiguity, if you're like, I want to do this thing and I want to do this thing really well, and I want like the parameters to be really clear. And if I have that, I can do a great job. Like, big company works better. Obviously the pay at a large company, like it's very different. That's very attractive. You The appeal of a startup is because there aren't a lot of people in the company, especially if you're early, you have opportunities to move into like more leadership senior positions, but it doesn't always play out that way. At a larger company, the ladder that you need to climb is much more clear cut. It's very explicit. Like these are the steps. This is what we expect from you. This is what we do. And the bigger the company, the more established that is. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for.
Shifting from the experience in the company to like maybe a student perspective of trying to get hired, what would you say are the different things that students should focus on when trying to get hired in like a startup versus like one of these big companies?
One thing I will say is right now it is incredibly competitive for a variety of reasons. But a lot of this started when companies started to do layoffs and make cuts. There's far fewer open roles out there available. There's far more really experienced talent on the market. And so there's more people, trying to get each role, and there's fewer of them. And so any role that gets posted at any level gets hundreds of applicants within like 24, 48 hours. It's really crazy. And so that's part of it. And I think it's important just to realize that that's the current state. And it's not always going to be that way. It wasn't that way even just 3 years ago. And it might not be that way a couple years from now. But even as things pick back up, like you're seeing certain companies who are saying that they're going to hire less. And so that's important to be aware of. Salesforce, Mark Benioff recently announced that I think he put a freeze on engineering hiring, at least for now. Mark Zuckerberg was on the Joe Rogan podcast and talked about, AI engineering agents and, his expectation on having people work with AI agents. I do know that for the roles that are out there today, it makes it really difficult for new grads because most companies, they only have so many people that they can hire, fewer than what they're used to. And so the people that they are hiring tend to be more experienced. And so even as roles open up, you're not seeing a lot of entry level roles. Hopefully that changes, but that's just kind of the reality of the market right now. So all that said, what are the strategies for like if you are looking for a job? First of all, for the companies that are still running internship programs, those are great. All the companies that I've worked at, especially large companies, have a really good track record of bringing on interns that go through an internship successfully and show that they're able to be impactful. In fact, a lot of companies actually have a goal around that. Companies don't consider an internship program successful unless they have a good rate of hiring people who did internships with them. So it's a very, very viable path to a company if you find you like that company. When you are applying, I think you have to be pretty responsive and quick. Like I said, job postings go out and they get flooded with applicants within the first couple days. I see a lot of jobs that they'll shut them down, not because they filled the role, but just because they have so many applicants, they can't go through them anyways. The best thing that you could do at a large company, applying directly cold by submitting your resume online is kind of like a last resort. There are a few other things that you should do first before you do that, because when you go through their standard online application, like you're in there with the other 100, 200 people that have applied, and you might be more qualified, but there's so many people in there that it's a little bit of luck whether or not someone notices that you're actually more qualified just by sheer volume. And so the first thing that you want to do absolutely is try to get a referral in. A lot of large companies have like separate policies around their referral queue. And so what they'll do is they'll say, okay, if someone is referred in, we need to make sure that recruiter or hiring manager actually looks at that applicant, and even if we don't move forward with them, gets back to them and lets them know one way or another inside of whatever 3 days, something. It's different for every company, but there's the likelihood that someone is actually going to look like a human is actually going to look at your application goes up quite a bit. So there's sort of like more hand holding and more attention to people who get referred in. So getting referred in is really important. That means even if you're not applying for a job right now, just networking and getting to know people at different companies is really, really advantageous. You don't have to have a super strong connection with someone for them to be willing to refer you in. It's pretty easy. For usually at a large company, there's like some form online that they go to. There's some URL they'll go to and they just submit you. And a lot of times they don't have to do anything else. Like they don't have to like answer questions about you, or like maybe they'll ask you, they'll like want to pass on your resume and contact information, and maybe there'll be like a line about like how well do you know this person. But even if they say they don't know you well, like that's fine. That happens all the time. And also the person who refers you doesn't have to be on that team in that function. So like let's say Google, really large company. Anyone that works at that company has access to that internal referral form. So if you're looking for an internship for an engineering role, it doesn't have to be an engineer, doesn't have to be an engineering manager. It can be anyone that you know that works at Google that will have access to the referral form. So there's lots of opportunities to figure out how to get referred in. If you can't get referred in, a lot of times what I'll do is if you go like try to find, if you have LinkedIn Premium, which is paid, but for me, I've at least found it worth it if I'm like actually actively applying for jobs. What you start to see now is like on some roles, you'll have someone from the hiring team connected to that role, and you could just message them directly. And I've had a lot of success with that, and it doesn't have to be super formal, just a casual message. I'll just message someone and say, hey, I saw that you're looking for this role. I'm, previously I was doing X and now I'm looking for Y. I saw this role. I think it's really interesting because of ABC. Would you be open to a conversation? Just something like that. And that works pretty well. So all those things avoid you having to go through like the automated filtering process. If you can't do any of that, sure, then you can apply online. And in that case, like do your best to optimize your resume, because your resume is going to be read by an ATS system. And it's going to rank you against the job profile on how likely you are to be a good fit for that role. And especially right now, if you've got a couple hundred applicants for a role, the recruiting team is understaffed. They probably cannot look at everyone in that queue, and so they're going to start at the top. They're going to start with the ones that are recommended the highest. And so your chances again of like you want a human actually looking at your application, your chances go up if you are sort of friendly to the ATS system. So that's in a big company that has like a lot of established processes and stuff like that. The other thing to think of that you may change if you're applying to a big company is the roles tend to be much more specific. So like let's say you're applying for let's take a design role. Let's say you're applying for an interaction design role, but you also have a lot of front end development skills. Those are probably not as relevant at a big company because practically speaking, they have an entire team that does all that, and that probably won't be part of your responsibility. If you're at a small startup, that could be really interesting because people wear different hats all the time. And so having someone who can kind of like fit in different roles, especially roles that they don't have, is really appealing. Matters less at a big company. What's more important at a big company is the thing that they're hiring you for. You do that really, really well. The other stuff you could talk about, but being sort of like, at a big company, you want to be like a 10 out of 10 on one skill. At a startup, being a 7 out of 10, but on like 5 different skills could be really advantageous. So that's one of the things that changes. At a startup, it depends on how big the company is, but the process can be much less formal. And so it can be more important. Like if you're going to reach out to someone at the company, it can be more important to try to get in direct contact with the team or the hiring manager or something like that. They don't always have like explicit policies around referral. So just because you're referred in, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Big companies will actually have like automations and processes around it. Small companies won't. So just in terms of like the mechanics of how recruiting works, those are some of the differences.
What are some of the big like lessons that you can take from the workplace in these very technical, very specific work environments, and then take them into startups and maybe like smaller groups? Like, because with students, like the immediate way that you can get started on doing projects and really working as a team is, of course, hackathons, which is what we focus on a lot. And are there like lessons that maybe students can take from you in working in real professional environments and bringing them to their own projects and teams?
Um, yeah, I think probably one of the biggest things you learn going from school to actually working at a company is all the dynamics involved in working with a team. When you're building software in a company, the teams that get put together are even more diverse than what you would normally work on in a school project. Even at a startup, like your typical team is at least going to have product management, design, engineering, maybe research, and then as the company gets more complicated or there's different people involved, you may have a someone who's a marketer, you may have a like an analyst. These are all really common. Every company sort of has their mix, but these are all like really common disciplines. So you could have four, five, six different disciplines on a single cross-functional team, all working together to try to decide what to build and then actually build it. And everyone brings their own perspectives. And that like figuring out how to sort of do that um, is probably the biggest thing that you learn. And so like one example of how you could solve for that with hackathons is by including like those different disciplines in your project teams, bringing in people who are marketers or maybe people who are business majors or designers and stuff like that. That's a little bit more real world. The the other thing that I think can be really helpful is, so a lot of times the way that, so I've run hackathons at several companies that I was at. The one that I was in charge of at Google for our team was, we had like maybe 20, 30 teams, maybe like 2 to 300 people across Europe. So we were doing it like at large scale. Sometimes the most important thing to figure out is whether something is technically possible. Especially right now, I think with a lot of like AI technology, like the need for like technical prototypes to actually see, can the technology do this, is becoming increasingly important, but not always. And so that's another like very real world realization that even if I'm a engineer or designer, that's not always the most important thing. Sometimes the most important thing to the business is whether or not people want this, or whether or not it's interesting to them, or whether or not they'll pay for it. So when you're at a company, especially at a startup, like in some ways, working at a startup is like a giant hackathon. Like you're trying to prove something, but it's not always the technical feasibility. In fact, more often than not, I would say the biggest obstacle is not technical feasibility. So you've got to go figure out, well, what is the biggest obstacle? Like what's the most likely reason why this idea would not succeed from a business perspective? And then how do I like build something to go test that? And so if you can sort of like expand, you were talking earlier about like, how do you kind of like see the bigger picture and expand your view? That's also one way. And so, when I've run these larger scale hackathons, if you've got 20, 30 teams, you'll see a mix. Like some people will be testing something out that you don't even know if it's technically possible. And so they'll spend all their time building technical prototypes. But some things technically are relatively straightforward, but you don't know how to make it easy to use. Like the experience is kind of tricky. And so they'll spend all their time building prototypes around that. Or sometimes you could build the thing, but you actually have no idea if anyone wants it. Like, is it even interesting? Is it appealing? And so you can build a prototype really quickly, but you spend all your time doing market research. Most startups fail, not because they couldn't like technically build the thing, but because nobody wanted it. And so like just kind of having that like more tools in your tool belt and just being aware of like the different reasons why you might want to hack on something, I think is really helpful.
Do you think for that reason, there's like a lot of potential for non-CS majors to like compete in hackathons and really like contribute to a hackathon team?
Yes. So the hackathon, we would run it every year, and the hackathons that we did, at least on my team at Google, were actually run by the design team. And every team had some of it depends on how you're scoring the projects. One of the criteria that we had on our scorecard was how diverse is your team? Do you have representation from these different disciplines? So I certainly think there's room for other disciplines, including design, in hackathons, but it depends on what the success criteria is. You have to design your scorecard to account for that. Otherwise, if your scorecard sort of rewards and incentivizes only technical prototypes, that's what you spend all your time doing during the hackathon, and then a designer doesn't really have a place as much.
Do you think there's a way to like market towards people? Because, from experience here at OSU, it's like the typical people we get who are interested right off the bat are just, you're very advanced, very technical coders, but when you kind of market that idea to people who maybe have never heard of a hackathon before, it's kind of a foreign concept. So they're like, I don't really know what this is. I'm not into coding. Why would I show up to a hackathon and be a part of this?
One of the things, and it depends on whether or not you want to change this. So I took over the annual hackathon when I was at Square. And one of the things, and it previously was very engineering focused, like 90% of the participants were from the engineering team. One of the ways that we got everyone else involved is we changed the scoring criteria, but we also rebranded the activity. The term hackathon is like inherently technical. Like people sort of assume that if it's a hackathon, there aren't things that I can do unless I can code. So we changed the name. We changed our scoring criteria, and then we also published a lot of content and guides and tips on different roles that people could play if they were on like a hackathon team. And we would actually go out and like proactively recruit people and say, hey, are you on a team yet? If not, like each team actually needs these roles. And a lot of these roles have nothing to do with writing code. So if you don't write code, it's totally okay. You could do one of these things. And so giving people kind of a playbook of what to do is really helpful. But they're like, if you think about, I don't know, if you like take Shark Tank as a theme or an approach where like you're basically pitching an idea, but maybe it's Shark Tank for software or apps. You're pitching an idea to a judging panel. But if you said, this is OSU Shark Tank, like people don't necessarily assume it's about coding, and you're trying to convince some judges that your idea is the best one. But there's different ways to do that. Maybe it's a really technical idea, and so maybe that's a team of engineers, but not all of them have to be. One company to look at that would be good is Atlassian. They really lean into their I think they do it annually, but they really lean into their hackathons. It's a huge ordeal. The whole company does it, but they come up with all kinds of stuff. And the ideas are not just software. Like they come up with all sorts of ideas on not only how to improve the product, but maybe how to improve things around the office, how to improve the employee experience, like all sorts of stuff. And they've written a lot about it, and they have like all sorts of guides. But if you were looking for a model of like what a hackathon looks like when it's more cross-functional, that's probably where I would start.
Okay, cool. This is just kind of like a side topic that we've kind of thrown in a little bit, but the topic of AI. What do you think AI's like effect on UX design has been so far, like in the last couple of years where it's started to kind of boom? And do you think there's a place for AI in the future?
I mean, I think there's certainly a place for AI in the future. The effect that it's had so far, there's a few things. One, I think there's a real necessity that designers are at least curious about AI and are tinkering with what's available and developing some knowledge because it's a new medium. It's not at the point where AI is, say, doing designs for you and automating a lot. I think for software engineers, AI is at a point where a lot more can be done automatically. It's not quite there with design, unless say you're not for UX design, not for like interaction design or UI design. If you do marketing design, like let's say you do things like landing pages and websites and ads, it's a lot further. And I would say like generated content, generated images and video and text and layouts, like more changes there. But a lot of what I do in the teams that I've been on is more about UI design, and AI is less capable of automating that. But if you're not curious and you're not aware of what's out there and you're not tinkering, I think you really run the risk of falling behind very quickly when it does become more directly relevant to your role. For certain disciplines, I mean, a lot of designers are being asked to design features that incorporate AI. And so it may not have a direct impact on how you design the UI, but the capabilities change. And if you're not a designer who really understands how the capabilities change or what's possible, you're not going to do a very good job of designing the right interface and intuitive interface. It's kind of like when mobile was the thing. Like designing for mobile, like an iPhone versus the web is pretty different. And if your entire career all you did was design for the web and then mobile came along, but you didn't really understand how people use mobile devices or what was different about them, and you tried to design a mobile app, it wouldn't be very good. And so that's kind of what's important right now for a lot of designers, is to understand AI and what's possible as a new medium. Some subdisciplines are impacted very directly. So for example, I was responsible for a team of conversation designers at Google. And conversation designers, a lot of what they do, there's sort of this hybrid between a writer and an interaction designer, and how that comes together in a sort of conversational interface. But before generative AI, you would do a lot of these things much more in a much more concrete way. Like you would have tree structures of different scenarios and different possibilities. And so you could define like, well, this is what the system says in this scenario. This is what it says in this scenario. So you had a lot more direct control over how the conversation went. With generative models, that's not the case. And so conversation designers, in some places, people feel are no longer necessary. And so that sort of puts that role at risk. I don't believe that's the case, but I think the skill set that a conversation designer needs to have and the tools they need to understand change a lot. And so for a conversation designer to be relevant, they have to know how to kind of like improve the quality of a conversation with a machine, with a chatbot, but you don't have as much direct control. Like you kind of have to know how the LLM works and how you can enhance training data and do fine tuning and write prompts to shape the conversation and the voice and tone and things like that, rather than actually doing it in a sort of tree structure. So there are certain areas where it's like changing very directly. I think eventually we'll get there. I think what'll happen is a lot of boilerplate stuff will be sped up. I don't know if it'll be fully automated, but it'll be sped up in the same way that code frameworks speed this up for engineers. Like a lot of code frameworks today, like you don't start from scratch. Like if you want to build an app, you bootstrap a lot of it. And UI design is a lot of UI design is that way. There's rules, there's patterns, there's best practices. And so as the systems get better, you don't have to think about that stuff nearly as much. And so you can focus on the more creative stuff. The other thing that I think will be important, you're seeing this today with writing, image generation, video generation. It's so easy to create a really large set of possibilities. So an important part of the design process is to diverge and converge. If you're trying to solve for something, first you need to diverge, come up with a bunch of ideas, because your best idea is not going to be your first one. And then you have to whittle that down to the best ideas. I think what we'll start to see is AI will be really good at the first one. AI can create a lot of possibilities very quickly and cheaply. But you're going to have good taste making to be able to understand how to cut out the noise and the garbage. And, because before, like if I were doing this myself, maybe I can come up with 20 ideas over the course of a day if I'm trying to come up with a product idea. But maybe using AI, when things are more advanced, maybe in a matter of 5 minutes, I can come up with 100. But do I have enough experience, and am I good enough to actually know which ideas out of that 100 are actually good? Because a lot of them are going to be garbage. So I think that's going to become really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to look out for in the future. We talked a lot about career, a lot about, how we can succeed in the industry, but I feel like we haven't really talked too much about what got you into this in the first place. So like, I'm just curious, what got you into this field of UX design?
Growing up, I actually wanted to go into the medical field. I wanted to be a doctor. And after my junior year in high school, I went to a camp for kids who wanted to be doctors. And we visited hospitals and schools and heard people who are in the field talk. And it was supposed to be like really inspiring and kind of give you an idea of what it's like to work in the field. And I came back from that and I realized it wasn't. I was excited about the idea of being a doctor, but I didn't really want to do the work. I wasn't that excited about doing the work. And one of the things that was really clear to me going through that experience is this is going to be a lot of work. And so if I was going to go through all that, I better enjoy it. I didn't think I would enjoy it. And so I came back my senior year for high school and made a complete change and spent more time focusing on art. At the same time, I've always been interested in computers. I built my first computer when I was in like third grade. I always I like to tinker. I always like to see what I could do and figure out with computers. And so I started putting those together. And at the time, I had a Mac and like that was basically all Macs were used for prior to OS 10, before it was a Unix-based system. They were good for creative programs. So I would tinker with like Photoshop and Illustrator, and I'd read articles, pick up books and magazines and everything I could. So I got really fascinated with just like combining art and computers. When I went to college, I went to San Diego State, studied graphic design. And so I did a lot of like traditional media. I did, paint and drawing and all the traditional art stuff. But every digital class I could, whether it was web design or digital photography or multimedia, I'd take it because I was also really fascinated with technology and computers. The way that I fell into it was kind of by accident. Any chance I got, I was playing around with this stuff. Even through high school and then into college, like if I wasn't doing my schoolwork, or even sometimes instead of my schoolwork, like I was trying to learn this stuff. And so I started my first company when I was a junior in college. And it was kind of just a natural extension of the stuff that I like to do on my own anyways. Like I was 90% self-taught. I learned some stuff in school, but most of the stuff I learned in school, I had already learned on my own because I was like so proactive in trying to teach myself this stuff. And there was a buddy of mine and we started our own business and we realized all the stuff that we thought was really cool and we were willing to do on our free time anyways, we could get paid for. And so that's kind of how I fell into it.
That's such a cool story, man. Yeah. If you could go back and give yourself like one piece of advice when you were younger, maybe to change the way you did things or maybe like a more effective way of accomplishing what you did, what would that piece of advice be?
In my earlier years, I probably spent a lot of time and like headache and stress worrying about the perfect and ideal way to do things. Because in those early years, I spent a lot of time figuring out the craft. And when you're practicing the craft, like the way that you practice and you learn is the ideal, perfect way to do things. And when you try to apply that to the real world and they don't happen exactly that way, I would get really frustrated. And I would assume that, well, things must be broken because we're not, there's a better way to do it. What's much more important is doing things in the pragmatic way. The real world has constraints, and sometimes the best way is not the perfect way. Sometimes the best way is just the way that it gets done, but faster or with less effort. So that took me a while to learn. And in my earlier years, all of the like getting frustrated when we couldn't do things perfectly, I probably could have saved myself a lot of headache if I realized that that wasn't always the most important thing.
Awesome. Well, wrapping up here, is there anything you'd like to promote or plug? Where can people find your work or where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. That's an easy start. I write a lot on LinkedIn about, growing your career, how to get a job, and a little bit about storytelling. I am on ADP list. So I mentor folks on a regular basis. I do all of that through ADP list. And I have a course on Maven, on storytelling that people could check out also. And I also have my podcast. Whole bunch of different ways that you can find me depending on what you're interested in, but all of those are available. And most of those you can get to through LinkedIn. They're either in my profile or I've written about them in LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Thank you for coming on the show. It was a very informative episode. I had a really good time talking to you, and I think people have a good time watching this one.
Cool. Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. Thank you.
See ya.